The reception to the Boneworks soundtrack has been incredible, and since a bunch of you guys have been asking me to talk about the process of making it, I wanted to do just that. However, I'm only going to be able to talk about what I wrote. Alex also wrote some fantastic stuff for the puzzles that are in the soundtrack, but I obviously can't speak on his behalf as to his process, although I do know that he used his crazy modular setup. And before I begin, as always, I wanted to thank everybody at Stress Level Zero for having me be a part of the team. I'm always ecstatic with just the process and what we get to create, and so I'm really grateful to you guys, as well as to everyone who's played the game and loved it. So anyway, let's get started. So, spoiler alert, if you haven't played the game, this is your warning. And if you're a music maker, also stay to the end because we're going to be doing a deep dive. So over the past few games with Stress Level Zero, I've really been thinking about what I personally like in a video game soundtrack. They tend to have compositional techniques as well as instrument or synth choices that they implement throughout that we might consider to be the signature sound for that game. And so I try to have some consistent techniques like that we'll talk about. For example, planing over a pedal point, hemiolas, cool dark harmony choices, and polychords. But the biggest thing for me is melody. Leitmotifs, memorable themes. In my opinion, the most important thing for music to do in any visual medium is to complement the viewer or player's experience and not get in the way. But if you can do that while ingraining a melody into their subconscious for the rest of their lives, for me that's what really sets music and media apart. I could sing you every piece of music from Mario or Kingdom Hearts, while there are other games where the soundtrack was a great fit and it enhanced the gaming experience while I was playing it, but I can't remember that game now for the life of me, or that soundtrack. So when I went to play Boneworks for the first time, Brandon and Alex told me a bunch of things. Among other things, they wanted me to make a very synth-heavy soundtrack, which makes sense due to the game taking place in a computer simulation, but they also wanted me to create a theme. And after playing a bit of the game, I realized that due to the way the story plays out, there aren't really a lot of different characters we can assign multiple themes to. So I figured if I wanted to get a theme stuck in your head, it would have to be something that I adapted either in part or totality for the entire soundtrack, so that you heard it over and over and over again. The mere exposure effect. Plus, writing the theme before any of the other music would give me that material that I could develop later on in the soundtrack. So Alex gave me different sonic references which informed the types of synths he wanted for the Bone theme. And in fact, he gave me his mini-log that he wanted me to use as much as possible for making the entire soundtrack. That mini-log and a little bit of Serum for the main pluck make up the entire theme. And that main pluck from Serum, by the way, is the same patch I use in ILY. To further place restrictions on myself and give it a less sterile sound, I wanted to play and record everything in with the mini-log live, as opposed to routing perfectly quantized MIDI and syncing it to my host computer. I also wanted to do any pitch bends or cutoff filters live while playing simultaneously to hopefully give it a sense of permanence, like when you're recording an acoustic instrument. Sometimes I even had to ask my girlfriend to move the cutoff filter when I had to play with two hands. The only other recurring theme besides Bone theme is the melody for Who Am I? And that was definitely inspired by the moment I was at the studio playing and fell into the void, hence the descending motif. I also started in the same way as the main theme with the first, second, and third note of the scale to help them feel related, an upward jump into the void before the descension, if you will. I wanted it to feel unknown and mysterious, hence some of the harmony choices like the augmented chord in the intro resolving to major, but also I wanted it to feel epic like you're descending into the void, hence the A section motif, and full of wonder, like the infinite possibility of the things that you'll find there, like the B section. And the B section has straight up R&B chords because I felt like the game music shouldn't take itself too seriously in the sense of realism as opposed to serialism. The game takes place in a simulation, and the visual aesthetic as well as the in-game humor take it away from this hyper-serious, hyper-realistic place, which is why I think it's so fun. So with those motifs done, I was able to write Bone Rhapsody, which Alex wanted for the main theme. And I'd always wanted to write a piano piece that used 2 against 3 and developed a theme over flourishing, implied harmonies since I was a kid, and I had played this piece called Hommage à Forêt by Robert Helps. It's an amazing piece, by the way. I highly recommend everybody check it out. Obviously, I couldn't get too impressionistic with the piece, but I felt like I was able to do a good job developing the Bone melody and the Who I Am melody in an exciting way. And the sheet music is available for Bone Rhapsody, by the way, in the description if any of you guys play piano. This worked out great because Bone Rhapsody is the first song you hear in the game, Who Am I is the second, and Bone theme is the last. So it's kind of like an opera, or, Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is Alan Menken's best work, where you have an overture at the beginning that plays you all the themes, and then you're kind of hit with the development of those themes, and then you finish with a reprisal of the main theme at the credits, where it feels like you've been building to this moment musically for the entire experience. And Opera de Ossium was actually one of the last pieces I wrote for the game. Brandon told me the scenario it was going to be in, and he wanted this Gregorian chant type piece, but less religious and more kind of epic and ominous. And I knew the vocalist was going to need to be a genuine bass, but I didn't really know any, so I asked my friend Ryan if he had any recommendations, and he recommended Hadrian. Unfortunately, Hadrian was too busy that week, but I knew my friend Tim was an amazing tenor. Like, seriously, listen to this guy. So I wrote a higher aria-type part for him while I was waiting for Hadrian. The lyrics I wrote in Latin mean loosely, "You must face driver. In Boneworks I lose myself. Stress level 0." Brett, the guy who plays Arthur Ford's real last name, is Driver. He was the next boss fight. Also, you get lost in Boneworks both in real life and canonically, because it's just a super immersive VR game. And stress level 0, cause yeah. Both Tim and Hadrian killed it, and I'm super grateful to them for contributing their amazing voices. Also notice the Who Am I theme mixed with the Bone theme in the interlude. It's everywhere. Forwards, backwards, faster, slower, fragmented. It's even in songs you don't think it's in. The synth version of Opera de Ossium, on the other hand, Brandon told me was for when the void entities are staring at you at the end of the game and you get shot. Did I not say spoiler alert? I knew it had to instill this sense of horror and dread, but again, in a Boneworks manner. By taking Hadrian's part in Opera de Ossium and reharmonizing it with some really cool chords and distorting the heck out of the master, so even the song as a whole feels like it's dying, I think we got something really cool. The museum is another one you guys have been wanting me to talk about. Alex wanted something super whimsical for the museum tutorial to make you feel like a kid again. In the vein of Pure Imagination from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Now, I ask you this. You're a composer, you've been asked to channel pure imagination, but you can't use vocals or any real instruments. How do you make that happen? What is it that makes pure imagination pure imagination? Well, it's got an amazing melody laid over a fairly standard jazz progression with some next-level orchestration and a wonderful vocal performance by Gene Wilder. There's also some subtle god-tier moves that Newley and Bricuse did, like how the chord choices directly mirror what's happening in the lyrics, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. I figured if I used a similar jazz progression, but I wrote it in 6/8, and I used my own melody, and I used a vocoder to get the vocal point across while having synths attempt to do some counterpoint in a similar vein to the original, it might work. It's obviously not as good as Pure Imagination, but I think the museum works really well where it is in the game. House of Penta? House of Monogon is a funny one because that actually came about because of all the John Wick comments we were getting on the development videos. I went in and I watched John Wick the first time, boy was I missing out. And I was inspired by what La Castlevania, who's actually a friend of mine, did for John Wick. I still had to make it work with Boneworks though, hence the polymodal planing in the intro and the warbly synths in the C section. That went over really well with you guys on release, so when it was time to do the actual John Wick style time trial for the 1.4 update, we knew we had to channel that same style of, hard mid-tempo house with the usual Boneworks accoutrements, which by that point were pretty well established, and that became Tactical Trial. While Bad Fantasy has one of my favorite runs I've ever written, what I wanted to talk about is a really effective and fun technique I used to create cacophony. Alex let me know about the boss fight, and it isn't really supposed to be scary, it's just supposed to be epic and yet incredibly bizarre. You're fighting yourself, who is apparently the king? And I thought it would be cool to get Bonnie, my siblings, and myself to just whisper about random things really fast to help with that feeling of descending into madness. On their own, you can hear what's being said, but when there's 20 of them stacked on top of each other, they're indiscernible. But still effective, I did the same thing with my friend Ryan for Duck Season's Meaning of Fear, and this is what Ryan is actually whispering about.
It could be why would it be Duck Season? Seriously. I don't know why. It's like, why? Because it's fantasy. None of the main characters are referenced in the title of the game. Ducks are things are saying. I don't know why. It's so secondary. Reality. This is what I see in my imagination. It goes about a dog. Why would you say that? Why would you do? Why does that happen? Why does that?
Fantasy Bone Arena I needed to make medieval while still maintaining its place in Boneworks. I felt like using the Dorian scale with the synths as well as some acoustic instruments like the flute and the cimbalom helped to create that vibe. Also, recording the trumpet fanfare for that same area with Mitch Cooper was wonderful because Mitch is amazing. That's it. Mitch is just amazing. Also, planing is super fun. Also, we recorded this bone theme motif on trumpet, and it kind of reminds me of a Family Guy segue. Deep Dive, Spectrum Omega, and a lot of the rest of the soundtrack were actually inspired by Bernard Herrmann, who I kind of considered the Prince of Darkness in film music. He always uses these dark harmonies, these pounding woodwinds, uses this thing that I like to call cellular writing. He has, whole tone floor. I mean, he's just amazing. I cannot overstate how much I love him and his music, and I listened to it throughout while I was writing Boneworks. Because of the way I limited myself on the mini-log, Sunset Arthur was actually improvised in one take on the spot. Obviously, the effects and the drums and the other stuff were added after the fact, but if you can imagine me on the mini-log and my girlfriend at the cutoff filter, and I'm screaming at her, "Okay, now slowly, go right, 2 o'clock, and stop. Okay, wait, and quick, to the left, go to 9 o'clock, keep going there, and stop." That's basically what happened. Runoff I use this soft synth called Lush 101 on. It has these really clicky attacks that I can't really tell the difference between it and analog on, so it sounds really, really great. I really recommend that synth for you music makers out there. Alex wanted alternative menu music for when you beat the game that was a lot more hopeful to juxtapose the dark ending of the game, since canonically you're now free, if you know what I mean. Which is how we got Light Shine Through. We thought it would be a good idea to put guitar on it to really differentiate it from the rest of the soundtrack, and I thought it could be cool to reharmonize the Bone theme in the relative major and do some post-rock licks based around it, since, I remember listening to bands like McQuaig and The Album Leaf and other similar bands in high school, and just, how they made me feel. The Monomat jingle was inspired by callbacks to jazz standards, especially for vending machine upgrades and other games like COD Zombies, Bioshock, and it's just a standard bunch of 2/5s with a really cool head, but I dig it. Existence plays when a crablet is on your head, slowly turning you into a VR junkie. And we didn't want anything scary, but more like, you're giving in, and soon your consciousness will float in the void as your body is controlled. Soon you will just exist, given to the void. Ambient Travel is another one everyone really likes that surprised me. I really like this one too, but I didn't think you guys would like it. I wanted to instill this sense of sophistication, almost like the museum is a fine dining experience, but set in the Twilight Zone. Analog Sunrise was another museum one that actually surprised me with how much you guys liked it. I never would have guessed that would have been received so well, though I'm not complaining. Believe it or not, when I was writing it, I was kind of thinking of the soundtrack for De Blob, if you guys ever played that. De Blob is crazy funky, but, I had to make it Boneworksified, and that's how we got Analog Sunrise. Little Tuscany was cool because we needed some traditional Italian folk music, but Boneworksified again. And I wasn't sure if that fusion would work, but Jonathan helped me out and he killed it on the mandolin. And I personally love this little cadence that is super in-your-face Mediterranean with the Bone theme. I also got to talk about Pick It Up. All the Radio Buddy memes and the other memes were hysterical. Jonathan and I love the response to it. I'm not going to say what Stress Level 0 game it was written for or why, but the fact that I got to play Ocarina on a song is really wild. One thing writing this song reminded me of is simplicity. I've been playing piano for 22 years, and when you're so comfortable with an instrument, especially one like the piano, where almost anything is possible, that kind of makes you lose perspective. With the ocarina, you can really only play one note at a time, and that causes you to focus on intonation and other things like bending notes. And more importantly, I suck at the ocarina. So being on a limited instrument that I'm really bad at was super refreshing because it caused me to just write differently than I normally would. And Jonathan and I had a blast writing Pick It Up, and I'm really grateful to you guys for how well it's been received.
Dude, Radio Buddy is like the best thing that's happened to me.
So like. Yeah, something like that. Future self.
I also hid pictures in the soundtrack using Harmor because it's fun. Now for the nitty-gritty that might be appealing to music makers. Besides the Minilog and Serum and the occasional live instrument, which were probably 90% of the soundtrack, I also used Lush 101, Harmor, Omnisphere, Contact, and this thing called the Axe Effects for the guitar parts. A really excellent plugin that I used on almost everything except the Minilog to try and make it sound a little closer to the Minilog was this thing called RC20 Retrocolor by Excellent Audio. RC20 can affect a bunch of different parameters like pitch, distortion, reverb, etc., and put them on an LFO so there's movement to those parameters. There's a lot of plugins that can do the same thing, but I really like how easy it is to use, and I just like how those algorithms on RC20 sound. Compositionally, besides developing the themes, I try to have consistent techniques that I use, and obviously these are not techniques I created, right? But techniques that I just felt as a collective would encompass this universe well, and that would make it sound like Boneworks, whatever that meant. And again, I just want to say, I know these aren't groundbreaking, and I didn't come up with these, and these have been used many, many times for many years, but boy was it fun to get to the opportunity to use them. One of the techniques that I used was not just sticking to regular diatonic modality, but actually venturing into polytonality at times, which is when you're in more than one key at a time. Sometimes this was over a pedal point like in Subtle Aggression, but other times they came out as polychords like in Creeping or House of Monicon. And when I was a kid, I would memorize these music theory terms from my piano teacher, and I would have no idea what some of those things meant and in reality and how they would ever be useful. Pedal points and polytonality were two of those terms. But Mars by Holst was the first piece that I became familiar with that showed me how cool these concepts could be when they're done right. John Williams uses them in Star Wars all the time, but they've been used by everybody from Jerry Goldsmith to Miklos Rosa to tons and tons of other film and classical composers. Another really cool technique I used a few times is a hemiola. You feel the entire piece of Bone Battle in triple meter, whether that's simple triple in 3/4 or compound triple in 6/8 is up to you. But when the drums kick in, there's a stark shift to duple meter, but it's still in 6/8, and it's still the same BPM. If you divide 6/8 in triple meter, which has 3 moon pulses, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But if you divide it in duple meter, which has 2 pulses, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So depending on the accents of the instruments, in this case the drums, you feel it completely one way or the other. But we can go back and forth with the counting at will. And so I also used a lot of odd meter on pieces in places that were supposed to make you feel scared. 4/4 is very predictable. The same thing happens every single time, and therefore it's comfortable. But if I'm changing from 4 to 7 to 9, you don't really know what's going to happen. And subconsciously, you pick on that temporal uneasiness, and it affects your gameplay. Harmonically, I loved all sorts of dark harmony, augmented, diminished chords, polychords for this game. But one chord that I really loved using is the minor major 7 with the added extensions of the 9 and the sharp 11. Bernard Herrmann uses it all the time, and it's a really weird chord because of, in particular, that sharp 11. Normally with a minor chord like a minor 7th, you might avoid the sharp 11 and opt for the natural 11 due to the dissonance of the major 7th between the 5 and the 11. While on a major 7th, you'd normally opt for the sharp 11, as the minor 9th that would be created between the 3rd of the chord and the natural 11 is way more dissonant than the major 7th between the 5th and the sharp 11. But if you're using a minor major 7, which is already a dissonant chord, the upper structure of which is augmented, which is what's making it dissonant, then why not make it even more dissonant? And the choice to make it a sharp 11, I feel, takes it in a brighter direction that kind of neutralizes the darkness of the minor 3rd. It still has the brightness of the major 7 and the 9, which is consonant, but I feel the 9 is neutral in terms of brightness or darkness. I feel that way because, the 9 kind of works on all qualities of chords. It can work on literally anything. So you have this dissonant chord that you don't really know how to feel about, and it's great, and I love it. So I'm kind of running long on this video, and we didn't get to talk about nearly all the songs on the soundtrack, but I just wanted to thank everybody, like I said, who's been playing Boneworks, especially you guys who have been talking about the soundtrack and buying it on your favorite platforms. You have no idea how big a difference it makes. So I will see you guys for the next soundtrack and for the next video.